Welcome to Kedem, and very glad to have today with us Professor Ishay Rosen Zvi, Tel Aviv University and Shalom Hartman Institute.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you, Alex.
And last time you talked about the Christianity, how it actually win. Why did Christianity win? This was the name of the previous episode. So today we want to dive in and to focus on Paul. And maybe we should ask the question, did the Paul invent Christianity?
Yes, good question. And the short answer is yes and no. No, because Paul did not know the concept, the word, the term Christianity. Christianoi, this term was invented after Paul. According to the book of Acts, it was invented in Antioch, and probably as a kind of name by others who called it maybe as a slur, even as a. And most scholars today will, scholars of Paul and New Testament and early Christianity will say kind of easily that Christianity was invented after Paul. Some will say way after Paul. And there's a book called Paul Was Not a Christian. And yet, I will argue that Paul created a fundamental rift, break, that will eventually become Christianity. And it is this rift that I want to characterize and narrate. But before that, we have to begin with some introductions in order to understand the world, the conceptual and the actual world in which Paul acts. Now, I have to be very honest. There is many kinds of readings of Paul. I will suggest a specific reading, not of a historian, and we'll see that the historical context is in and of itself quite debatable. But I will offer a reading of a textualist that takes Paul theology very seriously. And that's not a consensus. Some, for example, argue that Paul was a politician, was a missionary, and the theology comes later as a kind of tool. But I take his theology, and as you'll see, also his biblical readings very seriously. So a few introductions. Paul's letters are the first text that we have from one of Jesus' followers, okay? The 50s, right? The 50s of the first century CE. All the Gospels are much later all the Gospels are from after the destruction of the Temple of Herod in the year 70 CE. Now, the basic story is pretty well known, right? Paul is a Pharisee that had a change of heart and became a missionary traveling in the area of Asia Minor, preaching the atoning death of Jesus Christ. But when we move to the details, we see that there's lots of debatable areas. So according to the letter to the Galatians, he traveled for 14 years in the east, in Arabia and in Damascus, before he moved to the west. Probably in the east, we're not being told, but probably he preached to Jewish communities. And then he moved to the west and had a kind of new conception that that his mission is in the west, in Asia Minor, to Gentiles, to non-Jews. And we'll have to understand this new understanding of his mission. The details of his journeys are blurry. I mean, they are told in details, but only in the book of Acts, and the book of Acts is much later, dozens of years after the actual journeys, and there are very important differences between the way Acts describe, narrate Paul and Paul's own letters. For example, in Act Paul preached in the synagogues in Asia Minor. Paul does not mention it at all. He is the apostle to the Gentiles. No synagogues, okay? So we have to be very cautious. In the book of Acts, we have also the one only specific date regarding Paul's mission. The book of Acts 18:12 says, while Galion was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made an attack on Paul and brought him to judgment. Now Galion, the proconsul, refuses the Jewish request to judge Paul. Now we have an inscription that says that Galion was actually a proconsul in Achaia in the year of 52 CE. So we have here something, solid to stand on. But again, this is the book of Acts. What do we know? It's much later, etc. So on the one hand, we have a very detailed narrative, but late and questionable. On the other hand, we have contemporaneous reliable letters, but they are, lacking in details and partisan and partial, and so we're kind of, moving between these two, and you can understand why this is an endless, background for debates and discussion of scholars. And if this is not enough, the letters themselves are full with contradictions and differences, even in the same letter. Take, for example, the maybe the most important, theologically important letter, the letter to the Romans. In chapter 2, Paul says, Gentiles can fulfill the commandment. They can do it, kind of from their own initiative, right? From their heart. But then in the chapter 3 he said no one can fulfill the commandment, right? No one. And so we're all lost. So we have to understand that the letters are letters. They're contextual, they have addressees, they have rhetoric, they're not kind of theological presentations. So let's talk about the different context, okay, in which we have to place Paul. First, what is crucial for Paul is not Jesus, this is very important, is not Jesus' life, but rather his death, his atoning death. And this is in stark, kind of difference from most of Paul's contemporary colleagues, right? Jesus followers who took Jesus, the person, as the center of their belief, right? Jesus, the leader, the Chassid, the magician, the Messiah, right? But for Paul, this is all, insignificant. What is significant is Jesus' death that brought a new era, a new opportunity for atonement. So this is the theological context, but the traditional theological readings of Paul ignore the Jewish contexts in plural, okay? And the real revolution in Pauline studies in the last, let's say, 2 generations are to see Paul as a child of the Judaism of his own time. A Judaism that combines biblical interpretation and midrash, apocalypse, right? A combination that we know, for example, from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other, and mission. He's a missionary, which is also not very exceptional in the Jewish context. And so the real contribution of the new of scholarship of Paul, which is called the new perspective of Paul in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, to place him in this context, and thus to move the understanding of Paul's theological issue from the issue of, how human beings are saved, to a much more specific, Jewish-specific, I would say, question: how can Gentiles be saved? The traditional scholarly problem that was pronounced in the most, I would say, elaborated way by Rudolf Bultmann in the 1940s is that Paul had this existential issue, right? How can a human being, we're all immersed in sin, how can a human being be saved from sinfulness? And the solution, right, was Jesus' death as a new era of humankind. And the new perspective says, no, Paul does not think in these categories. He thinks in the biblical categories, in the categories of the biblical story of the chosenness of the Israelite and their way to redemption. And Paul's quest was how to bring the Gentiles, he is the apostle to the Gentiles, how to bring them into this story, a story of a specific people, right, of the Israelite. Remember, Paul is a Pharisee. He is a self-proclaimed Pharisee, which means he's a halachic Jew. He has a zeal to the right, to the commandment, to the halakha. He sees the Bible as the source of authority. He believes in providence, right? And yet, he is the apostle to the Gentiles. That's how he understands his call, right? In the way to Damascus, he was called to be a prophet to the Goyim, to the Gentiles, right? Just like Jeremiah, except that for him, Goyim are not peoples, but individuals, non-Jews. So how does he juggle between his Pharisaic background and his understanding of his mission? But in order to understand this tension, we have again to remember the different personae that he combines. He is not just a Pharisee, he is an apocalyptic Jew, just like the Qumranite, for example. He believed that he stands at the gate of the end of days, and that you need a special knowledge, right? Heavenly knowledge in order to understand how to cope with this period, okay? And so think about this combination of turning outside to the Gentile while believing that you stand right at the gate of the end of days, and that you have to have this apocalyptic knowledge, this heavenly knowledge in order to be saved. So, for example, his proof that the Gentiles are worthy of redemption is that they receive the Holy Spirit, right? Which means that they are chosen. So here we read in Galatians chapter 4. Let me read it to you. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our heart, the Spirit who calls out Abba. And here the Greek says Abba, the Hebrew word Abba, Hopater. Why does the Greek use the Hebrew word Abba? Because what Paul wants to say is that you in Galatia, right, in Asia Minor, you don't know what Abba is, right? But you nonetheless say this word. Why? Because the Holy Spirit speaks through you, right? And this is the proof that you are chosen. So in order to bring them in, he uses an apocalyptic proof, an apocalyptic narrative in order to show that they are chosen. And it's the same in chapter 3 in Galatians, where he says, you foolish Galatians, anu atos, right, without mind, mindless, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Portrayed in Greek, origrapho, meaning pictured. How was Jesus Christ pictured in front of their eyes? Through mystical visions. So he says, you have mystical visions. I know that because I was here and I saw this. And now that my competitors came and told you that, right, that you have to keep the commandments and be circumcised, now you kind of give up all these mystical experience you have. So he comes with his Pharisaic, right, identity on the one hand, and his apocalyptic identity on the other, and make his claim. But before we move to his specific claim, argument, what does he argue? What makes it so radical? What makes it so new? We have to see exactly which different parts of Judaism of his time he combines. He's an eschatologist, right? In the words of Paula Fredrickson, a scholar that I like very much, he knows the time in God's watch, right? He knows exactly which time is it, and it's very late. We're very close to the end of days. He's a mystic, and so through baptism you join Jesus' death. You join spiritually. You join Jesus' death. And so in his community there is mystical phenomena that show that they are chosen. In the book of Acts, by the way, he's also a magician, an exorcist, but that's not part of Paul's own story. And that's very important for me, he's also a great darshan, homilist, okay? And this is his language. He tells the Galatian, you want to preserve the nomos, the Torah, but you don't even read the Torah. Read the Torah. See the story, right? And so he is a biblical interpreter, like Philo, like Rabban Gamliel, like the rabbis, like some of the Qumranites. Okay, it was a debate around a shared text, right? How to read it? What does it mean? What does it say? So he talked to these Gentiles, right? He called them Gentiles, ethne, in Galatia, in Rome, in Corinth, and he reads the Bible and he interprets the Bible for them. They don't really understand what he says. Certainly not the minute details. He argues with his the other missionaries, his competitors, about Abraham. Was Abraham blessed before he was circumcised or after he was circumcised? They don't understand these minute divisions. But that's his language. That's his language. That's how he make his claim. So for me, these are not just cynical kind of rhetorical argument. That's his most basic conventions. Okay, and the verses he used are mostly from the beginning of the biblical story, Abraham, chosenness, and the end. Right? Isaiah, Acharit Hayamim, right? The later days or the end of time. Where did we come from? And where are we going to? But remember, Abraham and Isaiah are also two universalistic moments in the Bible, right? Avamon Goim, the father of many nations, and Or Goim, light to the nations. So of course, Paul used them in order to create his call, his new argument, his new vision. But what is his vision? Paul understands himself as an apostle to the Gentile. And the new era is the era where the chosenness is not confined anymore to this specific community from which he comes from, the community of Israel. Now, he is not the first follower of Jesus to preach to the Gentile. The community in Rome exists before him. He didn't build it. And at the very beginning of the book of Acts, we find Jesus' followers, the apostles, speak in different languages, the languages of different nations, right? What does it symbolize? It symbolizes that they are now turning outwards, right? And this is Pentecost, Shavuot. Why? Because it's a new giving of the Torah, right? Pentecost, the giving of Torah at Sinai, but now to all the nations, not just to Israel, right? The rabbi says the nation didn't want to accept the Torah, so it's only for Israel. But the book of Acts says now they do. Now they are willing to accept the Torah. So Paul did not invent this idea, but he's the first, the first follower we know of that understand his mission as an apostle to the Gentiles. That's his mission from womb, from his very birth. That's how he characterized himself at the beginning of the book of, at the letter to the Galatians. And therefore, he has to cope with the most basic question, right? Regarding chosenness, right? According to the Bible, God chose Israel, God will redeem Israel. So how do we cope with this discrepancy? And he uses different tactics. And scholars argue which of the tactics is his real, right, conviction and which are more kind of rhetorical, contextual. He used an argument from temporality. Until Jesus, it was one type of area. The area of the chosenness was confined to Jews. But after Jesus, there's a new era, right? New era. He uses another tactic of criticizing the Torah as impotent, as something that cannot fulfill the mission of, saving one from sin. And he also used a third tactic of letting the Gentiles into the story itself. He says, you are Abraham's seed. That's what he says, sperma in Greek. You are Abraham's seed. You become kind of adopted children. The central issue here is to understand how he keep his most basic conviction about that the Bible is the key, right, to explicating the reality, and his conviction that redemption is universal through Jesus Christ. So let us summarize this part before we move to the question of the rift. Paul is a Pharisee who persecuted Jesus' followers, who had a kind of turn of heart, understanding that he has a mission to preach Jesus' atoning death to everyone. But atoning death for whom? To all human beings? To Gentiles? To sinners? Why do people need this new evangelion, right? This good tidings, why? What is the problem that Paul is see Jesus as answering? I believe that we cannot understand Paul's basic problem without taking into account all his complicated personality. There's a very strong universal side to his mission. He understands that it has to be open to everyone. There's an apocalyptic side to his problem. And here I follow Gabriela Buccaccini, who I think very justly say, Paul did not invent this problem of being underseen. This is a major issue in the Judaism of his time, how to be released from the burden or the rule of sin. Enoch, Jubilees, the Damascus document, all deal with this ruling, right? Seen as an independent ruling force that we have to be freed from, right? We know that it has biblical roots, right? The idea of, how can we be released from sin? If you mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? Im avonot tishmor ya, ken Hashem ya'amod, who could stand? But Paul described this issue in an apocalyptic vocabulary, that this world is being ruled by these evil forces that we have to escape. We have to escape Satan's rule. Okay, and we know that Judaism offered all kinds of solution. For example, the Day of Atonement. The way the Day of Atonement was interpreted in several Second Temple texts is as a day of that kind of allow us to be freed from these evil forces, for example, in the book of Jubilees, or through joining a specific community, for example, the Yachad in Qumran, right? Joining the Yachad is, according to the Damascus covenant, is immediately free you from the rule of Satan. And for Paul, it is Jesus. Jesus as Christos, as the Messiah, and here I follow Israel Knoll in his reading of Paul, contextualizing him as part of a messianic revival in his time. And so Paul is an apocalyptic, Pharisaic, messianic missionary who sees Jesus as the new solution to this old problem of the rule of Satan, the rule of sin. But we see that there's, other similar Jews and Jewish thinkers and writers that, discuss the same issues and offer messianic solution to this apocalyptic problem. So what create the break? What create the rift? And now we get to the to the issue itself. If not apocalyptic and not the mission itself and not messianism, what create the rift? And here I want to talk about two rifts. The first one is his conviction that the way through Jesus and the way through the Torah are mutually exclusive, that you can't do both. Unlike James, Jesus' brother, and the Jerusalemite, the Jerusalemite followers of Jesus, who believed that Jesus and Torah work together and preach a kind of Torah-centered Jesus theology. Paul believed that these are mutually exclusive. And so he says in Galatians, if you are circumcised, Jesus will not help you because you chose the other way. You have to choose one or the other. These are alternative ways to redemption. Now that led to his flogging by the Pharisees, according to his own testimony, that he was flogged 5 times, right? But that's in and of itself is not enough to exclude him from his, contemporary Jewish milieu, right? To the contrary, flogging means that you're still in the community, right? Otherwise, how can they, they punish you? And we know that there's other Jews who were not committed to the idea of commandments. For example, Hellenistic Jews that Philo arguing with. But there is another rift, another source of break, and this is that his decision that he must go to the Gentiles. And he is, as I said, he is the first Jew who, or Judean, however you want to call it, who we know of, that sees all his mission, right, to preach the Torah outside. Philo was not such a person. Josephus was not such a person. That's a real innovation. But this, again, in and of itself is not enough, right, to create the rift. We know that there were other missionaries. Maybe they did not understood themselves as a kind of Jeremiah, Navi Lagoim, a prophet to the Gentiles, but they were, preaching to, so they said that the Gentiles must circumcise, but the very idea, what create the rift is the combination of the two. The combination of preaching to the Gentile to come into the story of redemption not through the Torah. This is the combination that is unprecedented. And this is exactly what he says in Galatians at the end of chapter 3. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, sperma, and heirs according to the promise. Okay? And unlike many scholars, I do not know of any precedent to Paul's claim that without being converted, you can become Abraham's seed. That's a novelty, a total novelty. And this creates a huge confrontation with the other missionaries. And so we have to understand what Paul does here. What Paul does is to create a community of Gentiles, believers in Jesus, who will be redeemed as Gentiles. That's the break. That's the break. Because that's create a totally new theology, that a total new understanding, unprecedented understanding of the biblical way of redemption. That's theologically speaking. Socially speaking, it creates the community of believers from a Jewish Messianic community that accept also converts to a Gentile community with a minority of Jews. Now, again, historically speaking, the separation will take time, hundreds of years, if you will. But theologically speaking, it is already there, because the idea that you can be saved as a Gentile, okay, without circumcision, without conversion, and become Abraham's seed is unprecedented, and is what create the story. And here I take very seriously the founding myth, the story that allow Christianity to become a Gentile, a non-Jewish movement. And again, socially speaking, it's a long process. But if we concentrate on the founding myth of what allow it, Paul allows it through his really totally new, right, story of becoming Abraham's seed through this apocalyptic joining Jesus' death rather than through the Jewish way of conversion. So what do I want to say? I want to say that on the one hand, this is total novelty. That no one, and here I insist, unlike many of my colleagues who said, yes, there were others that spoke about the Gentiles coming to Jerusalem at the end of days, and if you take seriously his belief that we stand at the end of days, therefore all the prophecies about the Gentiles coming. No, because Paul is not content with the idea that the Gentiles will come. He insists that they will become Abraham's seed without conversion. This is a totally new story. And for me, this is the founding story that allowed Christianity later on to become a new religion. But on the other hand, we see that all the material, the basic material that he worked with was there. It's a combination, because, innovations are always a combination. They're never ex nihilo. It's a combination of his Pharisaic background, his biblical readings as a darshan, as a homilist, his apocalyptic, right, worldview, that we have to find a way that the most important issue is to find a way to save us from the ruling of Satan, of this evil world, and his belief in the universal prophecies. All these are existing material, but the way he combined them is absolutely novel, and allow him to create this founding myth of becoming Abraham's seed without circumcision, the founding myth that will allow later on the birth of Christianity. So this is the long answer to your very pointed question. Did Paul invent Christianity? And that's why I opened and said yes and no.
Professor Rosen Zvi, thank you. And I have a few questions. First of all, nowadays, today, usually when we want someone to speak about any topic, we need first to establish authority. And in our case today, for example, I started our conversation by saying I'm sitting today with the professor, which is the first part of establishing your authority to speak on the topic. And I mentioned that you are working in two respectable institutions like Tel Aviv University and Shalom Hartman Institute. Why I did that? That was the way to establish actually your authority to speak on Paul. So for the Paul, establishment of authority is of course the story when he's going to Damascus and he is seeing the light from heaven and Jesus talks to him. But my question is, was actually the Paul aware of this story? Because in his writings, we do not see, in his letters, we do not see him in using this story to...
Oh, he does. He does use some small story at the beginning of Galatians. It is important for him, especially there, because there he polemicizes with his competitors, and this is exactly the issue. They argue against him. What's your authority? You're not one of the disciples. You never met Jesus. In fact, you were from the other side. You were persecuting us, Jesus' follower. So you're a kind of newcomer, right? What's your claim, right? What's your authority? And therefore this story is crucial, because he says, yes, I did not get my authority from the living Jesus. I got it from the Jesus after the resurrection. But that's exactly his claim to fame, that he is not a kind of natural, right, disciple of Jesus, right? He got a call. And remember, for Paul, the distinction between kind of natural follower and someone who got the spirit, right, is crucial, because that's also his story about Jews and Gentiles. Jews are the natural followers, the natural sons, the natural offspring, but Gentiles are those who got the call, right? Just like him. So it's the same story, basically.
And do you think he was aware of this story, or it was invented later on to...
If you take the letter to the Galatians seriously, he tells this story there. It's true that in the book of Acts, it is then much developed, and as story go, there's different layers, and then in the history of Christianity and the history of Western art, the famous paintings of Caravaggio and others, but the basic story is there. Yeah.
Another question. If what would you think if we currently will have Paul here sitting with us, and we would ask him?
Is he here? Call him.
Should come. She's a bit late. So if we would ask him if his intention was to create a new religion, or he was just thinking of the expansion of Judaism.
Yeah, no, of course he was not aiming at creating a new religion. Of course not. This is his understanding of the biblical narrative. His understanding, he saw himself as a Jeremiah. So just like Jeremiah did not want to create a new religion, although Jeremiah speaks of, Brit Chadasha, New Testament. So Jeremiah and other prophets, second Isaiah for sure, believed in a new era, a new era that demand a kind of new religious sensitivity, if you will, of course, they were revolutionaries. And Paul was a revolutionary. But of course he didn't think he created a new religion. He thought that he now tunes the biblical heritage to the new era. He created this new founding myth that allowed later for Christianity to kind of, and I know I have to be very honest, I'm in a minority in that, because most scholars today argue that Paul was a radical Jew. It's a title of a famous book by Daniel Boyarin. He was a radical Jew, and only later, in the 2nd century and maybe even later, we can speak about the birth of Christianity. Now, I don't debate it in terms of social and historical terms, but in terms of what created the founding myth, what I call the rift, the theological rift. I think that the moment that he allowed Gentiles to be Abraham's seed without circumcision, without conversion, is the crucial moment.
You just mentioned that Paul had competitors that also came from Judaism and talked to the Gentiles.
Not just came from Judaism, they were Jews.
Were Jews, yeah. Jews talking to the Gentiles. Yeah. So actually, what was the competitive message to Gentiles?
Most of what we know about them is through Paul's polemic. So we have to be careful, Because he very clearly kind of, make fun of their arguments. But through his polemic, we can kind of reverse engineer, and that's what scholars do, their argument. And they were arguing, yes, Jesus' death is atoning, and we must join him. And the way is open not just for Jews, but for Gentiles also. But if you want to join our story, you have to do it in the Jewish way. And to do it in the Jewish way is through conversion. And so what makes Paul crazy is that he created this community in Galatia. And he taught them how to join the sacred story of the Bible through, joining Jesus' death, through baptism, through his narrative. And then the others came and taught them that they must all, they said, sure, everything Paul said is true. There's just a very tiny kind of, tweak. You need also to be circumcised. And we always talk about circumcision because it's an androcentric community, It's, of course, there were women there, and Paul speaks to women, and they're part of the community. But the way they conceptualize the story through the heritage, pedigree. And so they said just one tiny thing, you need to be circumcised and keep the commandments. And Paul, Paul goes crazy because for him it ruins the whole the whole story. Because the whole story is to understand the new era. We're not continuing with this old story of, right, of the Jewish way of redemption. There's a new story. And if you can't do both, because then you don't take Jesus' death seriously. That's exactly what he says. He says, if you continue to keep the commandment, you actually testify that that Jesus' death was for vain, because we don't actually need it if we continue to preach, right, the old way.
One more aspect I want to discuss. I don't know if it's just Paul's approach or it's in general the Christian approach, because we remember from the teachings of Jesus, it's something against the family. That you can be saved personally, individually, by the belief in Jesus, and not as a family. And in the ancient world, the main focus is usually on the family. And if we read Bible, we know the importance of the family. Yeah, Abraham, family, Israel first, Yitzchak, Isaac.
Yeah. So yes and no, because on the one hand, yes, he insists that you become Abraham's seed not through your pedigree, not through your actual family. But I want to emphasize two things. Every conversion kind of break your actual ties. And the rabbis say, ger shenitgayer kekatan shenolad. A convert who converted is like a baby born. Okay? Because he's like, right? It's like a new creation, and he breaks his family ties. So in that, Paul is not creating something new. What is new is his the fictive pedigree that he creates, that you are adopted, right? Adopted sons of Abraham, right? I kind of plant you, and he uses this metaphor of planting, right? In Romans chapter 10, that you are kind of planted into the story. That's a real innovation, because the idea of adoption was very common in the Roman culture and Roman society, but not in Judaism. Judaism does not have a tradition of adoption because of this very strong emphasis on pedigree, right? So he takes this Roman idea of adoption and plant it into his Jewish narrative and create this fictive pedigree, right? That you become adopted sons of Abraham, and through this, right, I kind of bringing you to the heart of the biblical story.
Professor Ishay Rosen Zvi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, Paul was absent today, but next time we make sure.
Yeah, he's too late in God's watch.
He's probably busy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.